All right, well, welcome to another video. Today's lesson is about something that, well, how should we say that? I'll just write it. Oh no. Taxes. And actually, that's not entirely true. The lesson today is about consumer and producer surplus, how we go about measuring the gains that producers and consumers receive from trade. But the motivation for looking at these things is an application that's really quite important to a lot of what goes on in economics, and that is, in fact, the subject of taxes. And, you know, I suppose in some ways none of us likes to pay our taxes. We feel like it's money coming out of our pocket that we could potentially find better uses for. But as you'll find as we go through the course, there are some really good reasons why we need to collect taxes at the government level, either the federal government level or the state government level, in order to fund a number of different programs and so on that would not otherwise exist. And without getting into a debate about whether or not this program or that program is legitimate or is appropriate or is a good use of tax money, let's start the conversation by simply thinking a little bit about how taxes work, the kinds of effects that they have on the market, and then hopefully we can make good choices about tax policy, and we can save the debate for whether or not program A, B, or C is worthy for another day or another time. All right, so what we're going to start looking at to begin the lesson today is we're going to begin with just a really simple supply and demand picture. And I want to talk about the gains that the buyers and the sellers will receive from participating in this market. So if we get things sort of sketched out here with an initial starting point, we can have that conversation. So we know that when this market originally gets started, that it's in some kind of equilibrium, which let's call this Q star and P star. The actual values don't matter too much. And we know that from our discussion and study of, say, the demand curve, that on the demand curve there are a number of different consumers potentially represented. If we want to think about, sorry, get rid of that. If we want to think about this demand curve as representing different consumers, then we have individuals up here. Right, who's this? Nice. Who are willing to pay a great deal for the good, right? Their willingness to pay is quite high. We have individuals here who are willing to pay a little bit less. We have individuals down here willing to pay some amount very close to the equilibrium price. And then there, of course, are individuals down here who are not willing to pay even an amount as high as P star. So when someone like this person up here shows up in the marketplace to buy a unit of the good, they're willing to pay this amount way up here. Suppose they're willing to pay, I don't know, $9. And so they show up and they think, I'm willing to pay $9, but it turns out that the equilibrium price is only $5. Then this vertical distance right here, which amounts to, right between those 2 points, amounts to a $4 difference. That represents the surplus that this consumer is going to get from this exchange. So it's not $4 additional in their pocket, but if you walk into the snack bar at some point and you're thinking about buying a candy bar and you're very hungry and you're willing to pay $3, you only have to pay $1.50, you realize a gain because you didn't pay the most that you would be willing to pay. And we call that distance between these two things consumer surplus. And the consumer surplus for individuals way up here that are willing to pay a lot is, of course, higher than for individuals here, for individuals down here. Not because they pay a different price, right? In a competitive market, they pay the same price of $5. This person's willing to pay $9. This person's maybe only willing to pay, I don't know, $7. And so they get a consumer surplus here of about $2. This person maybe is willing to pay $6. And so they get a consumer surplus of only $1 and so on. So what we're going to do is we're going to think about potentially adding these things up to calculate all of the consumer surplus. And in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to eventually end up just sort of highlighting this entire triangle, and we're going to call that entire area, kind of shaded in here, that entire area is going to be consumer surplus. Now on the other side of things, let me get a different color here, on the other side of things we have producer surplus. And producer surplus is sort of the seller's analog to consumer surplus. To define it, we need to remember that the supply curve measures the cost in a sense. It's the minimum amount that a seller would be willing to accept in order to sell a unit of the good. And whether this is a single seller or multiple sellers represented on the supply curve, the first few units are sold, or they would be sold, could be sold at very low prices. As we sell more and we move sort of out to the right, we require a higher price in order to get those deals to happen. So maybe this is $2 right here, and so the first unit that gets traded generates a gain to the seller of the difference between 5 and something close to 2. And then for other sellers there are smaller gains, or for the next units there are smaller gains as we move up, and we end up again sort of filling in this entire triangle as we define the gain that the seller receives. Okay, so there's that green part is producer surplus. So the green one, that green thing, equals producer surplus. The red one that we had before equals, sort of shaped like this guy, is consumer surplus. Let me go ahead and clear the screen off and we'll talk about some other applications. All right, so these measures of consumer and producer surplus that we just defined are useful in lots and lots of ways. The primary application that we find here in Chapter 7 is to help us understand the effect of taxes. So remembering that we have these new definitions of consumer and producer surplus, let's quickly go back and remind ourselves how the model changes, or how the picture accounts for taxes. So I'm going to go ahead and start as we did before. I'm going to start with a model that is initially showing an equilibrium in a market. So I'm just going to draw a linear demand curve here and a linear supply curve. And again, the market starts off at some equilibrium price, call it P star, some equilibrium quantity, call it Q star. Don't forget to label my axes here. And make that a little bit darker. There we go. So the supply and demand diagram, of course, shows us our starting point. Now, suppose that something changes. Suppose that along comes a change in the market, and the change that we want to talk about is that we're going to add in tax, and we're going to think in this picture about an excise or a per unit tax. So this is something maybe like the gas tax is a good example of a tax that works in this way. You pay an amount per unit. You don't even know, because it's of course included in the price, but it is a per unit tax that we pay on gasoline. Now that per unit tax could be collected and remitted, collected and sent to the taxing authority down to Olympia or to Washington, D.C. or whatever by the sellers or by the buyers. Most of the time for consumer goods it's the sellers, and there's some administrative reasons why this makes sense. Some technical reasons, and it's usually the seller's the one who is collecting and remitting the tax. We're going to stop short of saying they're the ones that pay the tax, because that's a little bit of a separate issue, as we'll see here in a little bit. But they're going to collect the tax. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to think about an excise tax. The seller is going to be the one collecting it. When that tax is imposed, it's going to shift the supply curve. And actually what's happening is it's shifting the supply curve to the left, but it's going to do so in a way such that this vertical distance right here between these two things, that vertical distance, is the amount of the tax. And so this new supply curve is S plus the amount of the tax. Now, when that change happens, of course, we start off, we're initially in equilibrium right here. The market's going to shift to a new equilibrium. You won't be surprised to see that the price is going to go up. And the quantity is going to fall, because quantity demanded, we're going to slide along our demand curve, quantity demanded goes down. What we're interested in here initially at least, and we'll come back and talk about these price effects in a moment, what we're interested in, what is the effect on consumer and producer surplus. So let me go back for a second and show you where we started. Initially, just remind you, I don't want to draw, but remind you that initially consumer surplus is this big upper triangle, everything below the demand curve and above the price. Producer surplus is everything above the supply curve and below the price. And now we have some new situation. And what I want to sort of show you is that the effect of the tax is to reduce the surplus for consumers, to reduce the surplus for producers, to generate some tax revenue, and then ultimately to cause a loss of economic efficiency or economic welfare. So let's start at the new price. What is this? Let's just call this P new. This is the new price that the buyers are going to pay out in the marketplace after the tax. They're, of course, going to earn consumer surplus equal to that triangle, right? That's their consumer surplus. Fill this guy in. That's what they earn. Producers, well, producers they don't receive this price anymore because they have to collect and sell the tax. So the price that the seller gets down here, price for seller, is P new minus the tax. So again, this distance, this vertical distance, is the tax itself. So this is the price that the seller receives. This is their supply curve. This amounts to the gain that they're going to receive from this transaction. So that's producer surplus, the green triangle. Let's use pink. In the pink color here, I want to show the amount of tax revenue that's generated. Well, this is the tax, the vertical distance from down here up to here. That's how we defined it, right? Is this vertical distance, right? These lines are parallel, this vertical distance between the two supply curves. This distance from the vertical axis out to the new equilibrium quantity is the number of units that trade. So this thing ends up being the amount of tax revenue, this rectangle right here. So that's the amount of tax revenue that's generated that goes to, color that in, that goes to the taxing authority. Now again, there's some reasons we'll see in the next chapter that there are some reasons why collecting tax revenue makes sense, and in a pure sense, this tax revenue is going to go back to the buyers and the sellers in the form of police and fire service, parks, roads, things like that. Now, if we look at the blue, the pink, and the green, you'll notice that we've accounted for a big chunk of what used to be consumer, this upper triangle above this black dotted line, and producer, the lower triangle, surplus. But not all of it, right? There's this little part out here that we haven't accounted for yet. And that little part is really important. I'm going to color that in black here. That little part disappears. And you say, well, how disappear? It doesn't disappear. Well, but in fact it does completely and utterly vanish. And the reason is that when the tax is imposed, of course, quantity falls, right? This is the new quantity out here. And that new quantity being lower than the existing one means that there are some trades that used to happen out here at Q star that do not happen down here at Q new, at the new quantity. When those trades don't happen, even though the demand, the amount that the buyers are willing to pay, exceeds the amount that the sellers require, then we end up losing some surplus. And that thing right there, Colander calls it an excess burden, another term that you'll often see, so excess burden. You also see this referred to from time to time as a deadweight loss, DWL, deadweight loss. So in the sense of kind of economic welfare, economic efficiency, the amount of surplus generated, it's that deadweight loss or that excess burden that's really our concern. And as we'll see in a moment, talk through a few other tax circumstances or situations, we'll see that that excess burden can either be small or large depending on the nature of the good that we tax. I want to think a little bit about the different situations in which we might impose taxes. So there are lots of different goods that we can consider for taxation. And one of our concerns, not the only concern, but one of the concerns that we should keep in the front of our mind as we're considering different items that might be appropriate for taxation is the effect that that tax is going to have on quantity, because in situations where we have a large effect on quantity, where quantity falls a great deal, we're going to generate quite a bit of deadweight loss or excess burden, and in situations where we have less effect on quantity, we're going to generate a smaller excess burden, and we end up with a more efficient outcome in that case. So I'm going to draw two cases side by side here, and let's see where I am in colors. Okay, good. Start with that. So two different situations. The picture on the left is going to have a very steep demand curve. And we'll just draw kind of a typical looking supply curve. The situation on the right is going to have a much flatter demand curve, something like that. And I'm going to try as best I can to draw basically the same supply curve that I drew in the other picture. So the supply curve should be more or less the same. What differs, of course, from the left picture to the right picture is that in the left picture the demand is much less elastic than in the right-hand picture, right? Quantity effects are quite small here and they're quite big over here. So let's draw on both of these pictures now the same excise tax. So I want to draw on the same effect. All right, so there's the excise tax, S plus tax in this particular picture. And then over here, extend that guy out, right? So S plus tax in that picture. So we have that that tax drawn in both cases, and we should have labeled, let's go back and do that, the initial equilibrium quantity especially. Maybe we can just stick with that for now because that's going to turn out to be the important part. So the initial equilibrium quantity in each of these two cases. And what you'll notice even before I draw it in, of course, is that over here when the tax is imposed, quantity falls a little bit, and over here when the tax is imposed, quantity falls a great deal. Now what's important for our purposes here then, if I go and draw in that new quantity, right? So here's the new one at the new equilibrium after the tax imposed, and here's the new one over here, is that you'll notice that the deadweight loss, or the excess burden, which is this triangle right here, right, this little guy, the amount that gets sort of shaved off, that area is very small over in the left picture compared to this area over here. And that's the concern. So if we're trying to think about goods that should be subject to taxation, we would probably be well served, all other things equal at least, we'd be well served to think about goods that have relatively inelastic demand as opposed to goods that have very elastic demand. This could be a popular, and there's other reasons why these things are popular as well, but a good example over here might be cigarettes. So cigarettes tend to have very inelastic demand, at least in the short run, and so if we tax them, well, we may generate some health benefits for smokers as well, because it may hopefully makes them smoke a bit less, but in any event, we're not going to get much distortion in the cigarette market because quantity isn't going to fall very much. Over here, if we tax, I don't know, what is this, luxury boats or something, what tends to happen is we tend to see fairly large changes in quantity, right? It tends to fall a lot, and we tend to generate big distortions. In fact, one of my favorite stories, going back a few years, I think this was in the late 1990s, was an example that in fact did involve luxury boats. Congress passed a tax, an excise tax on luxury boats over a certain price tag. I think it was over $1 million or something like that. And so the quantity sold and the demand for luxury boats very flat, very elastic. And so what happened is that people reduced their consumption. A lot of them bought $900,000 boats instead. And the net effect was well, it didn't generate much revenue for one thing because quantity fell a great deal. So the projection, I think it ended up raising about 10% of the revenue that it was forecast to raise. And in the end, it ended up mostly hurting folks who worked in luxury boat manufacturing facilities, a lot of them in the South, and Florida in particular, and didn't really hurt the buyers of luxury boats much. They just bought a plane or two smaller boats or something like that. So it was a little bit of an inconvenience, but not a huge problem. But the real difficulty was that a lot of luxury boat manufacturers went out of business, had to lay off their workers, and we ended up in a situation where Congress very quickly, after a year or two, realized that was a bad idea. They repealed the tax and went back to the way things were prior to that. Now there's one last thing that I'd like to show you, so I need to get a clean screen here. So I'll come back in just a moment to talk about the burden of the tax, and then that'll do it for today. All right, so just one last point, and this is going to follow the same kind of pattern as what we just saw, is I want to draw a couple different examples of supply and demand curves. Wow, that was too big. Okay, hold on. Let's undo that. There we go. Two different versions of supply and demand curves with different sloped demand. And we could tell a similar story with regards to supply as well, but we'll just stick with pictures that look very much like the ones that we just drew, interpret them slightly differently. So on the left, we're going to have the steep demand curve version. On the right, we're going to have the relatively flat demand curve version. Same supply in both cases. Something like that. And we're going to impose a tax on this market. So S plus tax as before, and make it look more or less the same. S plus the tax in the market. Oops, tax, there we go. And what I'd like to, so we talked about the difference in the excess burden, right? Small on this side, large on this side. What I'd like to point out here is the effect on who actually pays the tax. So the way we've drawn this, the suppliers are the ones who remit the tax. They collect it and they send it off to the taxing authority. Who actually pays, or what Colander calls the burden of the tax, depends on the nature of elasticity of the supply and the demand curves. So on the left-hand picture, what you'll notice is that the price starts off here, right? That's the initial price, and the new price is quite a bit higher. Way up here, remember that we can always find the amount, I need to be a little bit more precise here, we can find the amount that the seller actually receives by dropping down from the new price until we hit the supply curve. So I have the original, call it P star, I have the new one up here that the sellers pay, and then I have this guy right here, which I'm going to call P seller, and the difference between P new and P seller is the amount of the tax. So what we see in this first case is that when the demand curve is quite steep like this, that the amount of the tax paid by the seller, or I'm sorry, by the buyer, that vertical distance is quite high compared to the amount paid by the seller, which is this one. So in this example, if this tax is $10, it looks to me that the buyer pays maybe $8 or $8.50 or even $9 of the tax, somewhere in the 80-90% range, and the seller pays that little bit down there at the bottom. Over here, of course, we have a different kind of story. The market originally starts off in this at this price, P star. After the tax is imposed, price goes up. That's not a big surprise, but the question is how much? And the answer here is not much, and especially not much when we compare it to this price, which is the amount that the sellers receive. That's what we've been calling P seller. So again, here the buyer pays, what's it look like, maybe 25%, the seller pays 75%, something like that. So the burden, who bears the tax, is quite different in the left picture than in the right picture. Tax is the same, right? Say a $10 tax in both cases. Over here, the buyer pays a lot, that is, price rises a great deal, and over here, the seller pays a big chunk, or a bigger chunk. And so it's important to remember that when a tax is imposed, it's almost certainly, in all but the most extreme cases, it's going to raise price some. It's going to raise the observed price, the price that the buyer pays, a bit. Now, how much of that tax can be passed on to the buyer is an open question, and it depends on the nature of the good. Again, for cigarettes or for gasoline, a good like this over here, an increase in tax is going to raise the price. Not the full amount of the tax, mind you, but nearly the full amount of the tax, a big, big chunk. For luxury boats or other less necessary items, things with more elastic demand, the buyers don't really have to pay a whole lot more, and most of the tax gets picked up in the form of lower seller prices. So that's about all for now for Chapter 7. I hope you got some good things out of the video, and I'll see you again for another lesson.